Okay, today we are going to read the morning, which is the last chapter in this section, I believe. I don't know, we'll see. You know me and my inability to remember that kind of stuff. Anyway, the chapter questions for the morning are, first, why was the Reverend, whose last name we don't know, chosen as spokesman? How do the perspectives between the men and the boys vary concerning the probable arrival of the British? What are their opinions? How is Moses' attitude toward the British indicative of his personality? What we're really getting with some of these questions is we're building a personality journal in a way, particularly about Moses and about Adam. So we're looking at Moses' attitude toward the British. Why does Adam want to be there when the British arrive? What questions are left after the first shot? Did running from the battle create questions of ethics for the townspeople? Remember that ethics means values and your moral compass, the thing that directs where you go morally. Number 6, what does Adam mean when he says, I'll hide in the house and hide in the woodshed? And even if I come out into the sunshine one day, I'll be hiding. That's an extremely important quote in the book. Going back to Moses' attitude toward the British, one thing you have to know is that when the British put together the war, they mustered their troops. A lot of the regular fighters were people who had been taken out of prisons. The officers are the gentlemen, the people who are supposed to know how to behave in war. But we'll see how that develops. Okay, with that said, page 81. It had become darker. There was a ragged veil of clouds over the moon and the stars, and my father bulked large and formless. I became tense with the feeling that perhaps it had already happened, that the British army was upon us, and that I would be left out of it. But whether I was pleased or dismayed, I hardly know. You know, if I didn't know what the word dismayed meant, I would look at the fact that pleased is something good and something I would be happy about. So dismayed must be something that makes me sad or upset. We went through the gate, and without a word to each other, we began to walk over to the common. I noticed now that in many of the houses the lights were out, leaving only the ruddy glow, the reddish glow of the kitchen fire. It was colder. I shivered and drew my jacket together. A subtle change had come over the village. A little while ago the night had been full of sound, the high-pitched sound of boys' voices against the flatter sound of their elders, the sound of bells, the sound of a rush and clatter and commotion, and nervous laughter. But now all of that kind of sound was gone. You heard single voices. Mrs. Carter called out to her husband, "Jed, you forgot your notebook." Why on earth he wanted his notebook with him in the pitch blackness of night, I don't know. From somewhere in the darkness, I heard the Reverend's deep voice telling someone to trust in the Almighty Maker. I sympathized with whoever it was. I have never been able to work up a feeling of being properly looked after, and it was worse in this darkness. Father stopped at the edge of the common and took hold of my arm. "Adam," he began. "Yes, sir." "I don't know how to say what I have got to say to you. I'm certain nothing will happen, but something could happen, and you might have a heavy burden." I nodded. Then Father put his arm around my shoulder and held me to him for a moment. It was as close as he had ever come to a gesture of real affection, and it made him uneasy, and he began to complain about the night air and how it always gave him catarrh. We started across the common, and the Reverend joined us. "Adam," he said to me, "I'm glad to see you with us. I have found that when adversity confronts them, the Cooper men stand firmly. God bless you." It was a thoughtful thing to say, and it made me feel better. I suppose that when someone like the Reverend really applies himself to his job, he gets into the habit of saying the right thing at the right time, something I was never good at. It made me regretful that I had no predilection, no desire for the cloth. "Would you know the time, Reverend?" my father asked. "Close to 4 o'clock, I think." The Reverend carried no gun or victuals or food, nor did he appear to be downcast. He put his arm through mine, and we walked toward the little cluster of men already gathered in the center of the common. At the same time, Cousin Simmons came from another direction, carrying an iron torch with a pitch cup at the top of it. He thrust this into the ground, and the flare of the pitch drove back the darkness and cast a circle of light upon the muster area. Already at least 20 men were present, and others were coming by ones and twos from all directions. It had seemed to me that what with the nighttime and the distance some families were from the village, we would not muster more than 50 men. But it turned out that before dawn 70 men were on the common in the muster. As we approached them, I noticed that they were standing around in clusters, shivering a little in the pre-dawn chill, trying to be casual and make out this kind of a nighttime call to arms and muster was an ordinary thing that a man might expect any night of the year. The older men were talking about everything and anything, and the younger men and the boys were listening. And those telling stories tried to make themselves out as men of the world and men of wide and varied experience, even though everyone had known everyone else for the best part of their lives, even though hardly anyone in the group had been much farther from home than Boston or Providence. Caleb Harrington was telling the story, which I had heard in one variation or another at least 5 times already, about the red-coat soldier who went into the rum pot in Boston and ordered boiled pudding and cheese. There was a great deal of disdain among us concerning the wretched food the British seemed to enjoy, and their lack of taste or discrimination when it came to food. This tavern keeper in the story was a sturdy committee man, and he brought the soldier a maize pudding left over from the week before and a cut of cheddar cheese his wife had been saving for the rat trap. Boston rats are known for their strong stomachs. Well, the redcoat took a bite of the pudding and swore some choice London oaths, and said he had never tasted the like of it. The tavern keeper told him it was Indian pudding and begged him to try the cheese. The redcoat took a bite of the cheese and turned purple, and the tavern keeper said it was Indian cheese and calculated to take the hair off your head. The redcoat was in a real fury by now and calling colonials a colorful assortment of names. Now the tavern keeper palmed an old scalp he had been keeping leaned over the soldier, and came back up holding the scalp which he had placed on the table. That was the kind of story it was, and I thought it lacked humor as well as other things, but it raised a great laugh out of the men there. Someone else started another story immediately, the idea being that the guy made it look like his hair had come off. I saw Jonathan Crisp and Abel Loring, and I wondered whether I looked as small and cold and uneasy as they did. I went over to them, and we exchanged greetings very seriously. Abel Loring had a British supply musket with the bayonet stuck in his belt. He was a year older than I, but much smaller, and he grinned sheepishly as he showed me the bayonet. "I don't know what to do with it," he confessed. "Can't you just see him sticking that into a redcoat belly?" Jonathan Crisp guffawed. Abel Loring turned a shade of white and admitted that the very thought of sticking it into anything made him want to throw up. Okay, let me hold on. By the way, guffawed means laughed. I didn't do that very well reading it to you. He's done that already. I had never liked Jonathan Crisp. "The trouble is," said Abel, "that I'm afraid to sit down." "Why don't you just throw it away?" "I can't do it. It's committee property." Jonathan Crisp took out his pocket watch, a present from his rich uncle on his mother's side, who was a chandler in Boston. 10 minutes to 4, he said, as if all the minutes in the hour were his own and exclusive possession. Then the Cosden brothers came over to us, and I left them and walked over to where Father stood with Cousin Simmons, Jonas Parker, Samuel Hodley, Simon Casper, and the Reverend. Simon Casper lived in Concord, but he had been on the long march to Quebec during the French War. That would be the French-Indian War. And he had volunteered to help train the militia in our town. He had ridden over by night after the news reached him, and he had somehow found time to put on his old green army coat and his big cocked hat. He was the only one among us who had any semblance of a military appearance. I stood a little distance away, still not completely certain that Father wouldn't change his mind. Either this was an unusually cold April night, or else any April night was provokingly cold when you went without sleep and spent your hours standing in a damp field. I pulled my jacket close and put my hands in my pocket, and when they closed around the bread, I suddenly felt starvation and hungry and unable to endure another moment without eating. We made good bread in our town. For one thing, the whole wheat varied with stone ground, not into fine flour, but into a sort of meal. Mother kept a wooden sour tub in which she mixed her dough and set it to rise. Every family had their own sour tub then, and that gave each bread its own character, each a little different from any other. Mother sweetened her bread with honey, salted it strongly for keeping, and mixed a wet dough. The finished loaf would be brown and heavy and damp inside, and would keep for 10 days before it began to go dry and hard. I don't remember anything in all creation as good as that bread during the first few days after baking, and now I broke off small pieces and chewed them, holding my gun under my arm and hoping that no one would notice me. As it would turn out, there was no need for me to worry about Father recalling the unreliable elements of my character and deciding that I would do better home in bed than out here on the common, with a bird gun in my pockets full of bread. He had found a point of deep and constructive difference with Simon Caspar. Imagine that. Simon Caspar should have known that my father was bored to distraction with local argumentation. For one thing, aside from the Reverend, there wasn't a man in town who could stand up to my father and give and take properly in any dispute. Some of them, like Cousin Simmons, actually disliked arguments and attempted to avoid them whenever possible. Others enjoyed a good dispute, but were not equipped. And still others had been beaten to a mental pulp so often by Father that they avoided controversy with him the way a whipped dog avoids a fight. But Simon Caspar hadn't been around enough for Father to take his measure properly. And when he suggested that the men stand ready with weapons at full cock, Father and the Reverend lined up shoulder to shoulder against him. "There's nothing in the world more dangerous and uncertain than a cocked gun," Father stated. "It's a case of preparedness," said Jonas Parker. "For what?" "For whatever's likely to happen," Caspar said. "Whatever's likely to happen, or even unlikely to happen, is sure enough going to happen when you have a cocked gun in your hand." "The point is," the Reverend put in, "that it mustn't happen." He raised his voice somewhat so that anyone within a dozen paces could hear him. "The British are coming. That's right. We have more certain information than before. 2 hours ago they were forming up their ranks on this side of the river. We don't know exactly how many, but it could be almost 1,000 men. Whatever my own thoughts on this matter were, it doesn't matter now. We have decided to spell out our principles with our presence. We have done no misdeeds, only stood by certain rights and privileges that are granted to us by the Almighty God and the struggle of our fathers. We are required to be firm and calm, but not to die. Ours is a way of life, not death." There were a good many amens, and I don't mind saying that the Reverend's words cheered me enormously. But Simon Caspar wasn't satisfied. He said if you were going to fight, you had to make up your mind about it. "We're not here to start a war," Father said, "but to prevent one. Then we ought to take cover and close the shutters behind us." "All I'm asking," Father said, "is to avoid accidents. I'm saying that we don't cock guns or handle triggers. We show ourselves here plain, firm, and quiet. We talk. This is our village and our land." "You and I know that," Caspar said, "but do the British?" And you aim to teach them that, with a few dozen men against 1,000, Father said with quiet contempt. "Let me tell you something, Simon Caspar." He waved an arm at the dark shadows of the houses around the common. "Those are our homes, and inside them are our wives and children. So move gently before you come here with a war. Move gently." He was disgusted with the man in the green coat. It was not even an argument. The Reverend drew him away, and I trailed after them. "Easier to let the devil out of the bottle," the Reverend said, "than to persuade him back inside." "I hate fools. Blame the devil, Reverend, but I tell you that 3/4 of the misery of mankind is the result of plain damned foolishness." He drew out his watch and tried to see the hands. "What do you make it, Reverend? I've lost me a day somewhere. This is Wednesday morning?" "Wednesday morning." Father glanced at me briefly as if to say something that he thought better of. In a low voice, the Reverend said to him, "They were here tonight." "Who?" "Sam Adams and John Hancock." "Oh, no," Father said. "Now what in heaven's name were they doing here?" The Reverend shrugged, the gesture saying better than words that these were two men with their own ways. "Where were they?" "At my house. And now?" "I didn't want them here," the Reverend said bitterly. "Would you want them here, Moses?" "We got our troubles here." "So it seemed to me. I can't understand any more how this started and the way it is building up. Who chose tonight? Ourselves? The devil? The British? No, I didn't want them here, and I told them to go to Burlington." "They left?" "About an hour ago, Moses. They have their problems and we have ours." Some of ours were approaching. Jonas Parker came over with Samuel Hoadley and Cousin Simmons trailing behind. Cousin Simmons came to me and put an arm around my shoulder. "It's a long night, Adam," he smiled. "The longest." "Are you angry, Moses?" Jonas Parker asked. "I get impatient with stupidity, not angry," Father replied. But the other way around would have been fairer. He couldn't abide what he considered a stupid man, and he never stayed put long enough to qualify for impatience. "No use calling this one stupid or that one smart. It's too late." "That's a fact," the Reverend nodded. "The point is," Jonas Parker went on, "that we ought to decide who is going to do the talking, the committee or the militia." "I thought you decided that," my father said. "I've noticed that a man with a gun usually shortens his arguments." "That's no way to talk, Moses. You've got a gun and so has your son Adam. and I pray to God I'll not have to use it. As we all do, the Reverend said soothingly. I think you'll grant, Moses, that Jonas here raised the question of a spokesman himself. That's fair enough, Cousin Simmons added. My father appeared mollified and offered a compromise. He and the Reverend would talk for everyone. I'd hardly call that a compromise, said Simon Casper, who had joined the group. Why not one from the militia and one from the committee? Since he was a Concord man, it seemed to me that he was being a little pushy and perhaps felt that he ought to be the spokesman for everyone. He was not a likable man. He made me nervous, and I think he made others nervous as well. But finally they all settled on the Reverend. For one thing, he was unarmed, and would thus be in himself a physical proposal for a peaceful exchange. He would talk for the committee, the town, and the militia as well, since his congregation included practically everybody. I must say that I didn't envy him having to stand out in front of with no gun or way of defending himself, but he appeared to be relieved at the suggestion. There's only one thing that troubles me somewhat, the Reverend said. Suppose they see us out here but just decide to ignore us and march on past us up the road. After all, it's plain enough from all I hear that they're interested in Concord, where the stores are. Well, what then? By God, then we stop them, Simon Casper declared. Oh, man, use the brains God gave you, my father said, and Casper bristled and said he was sick and tired of listening to Moses Cooper's insults. When the day comes that plain discussion is characterized as insult, I'll move out of New England, father snapped. I'm only trying to make the point that there exists a certain disparity in the size of the forces concerned. The plain truth of the matter is we can't stop them. What do you want, sir? A bloodbath? Jonas Parker agreed. Moses is right, Simon. My feeling is that we take up our positions here and hold them with dignity and courage. If they propose to march on past us, why, they march on past. Of all the damn things! Most of the militiamen were listening to the discussion now, and half a dozen side arguments broke out. Father shouted for silence. Let's hear from the Reverend, he said. On the outskirts of the huddle, Jonathan Harrington, Caleb Carrington's 17-year-old brother, or son, began to play the red coat bangle on his fife. Fife is a flute. Jonathan, shut that pipe off, his father shouted at him. The Reverend raised his arms, and when he got a little order, he said to us, It seems to me that we haven't as many choices as some of us imagine. We are not here by choice, but because our consciences dictate that we assert our primacy in the place of our homes and birth. We are not soldiers and we are few in numbers, so I think we can end any discussion of fighting the British Army, regardless of the ethic involved. However, we do have a role to perform and we must see it through. In Boston, where we all of us have brother and sister, mother and father, aunt and uncle, and 100 kin ties of blood and friendship, the British have seen fit to wipe out every vestige of freedom. They have taken quarters, moved into people's homes, as they see fit. They imprison this one and that one as they please. This is all true. They have shot down innocent men in cold blood. The streets are filled with drunken bullies in red coats, and there remains only a memory of what the city once was. It is not our choice but our necessity to prevent the same thing from happening here in the countryside, and we are drawn up here for that purpose. We stand with our arms in hand, but with no belligerence in our hearts. I do not think the British will pass us by. They have too much false pride for that. They will demand to know for what purpose we have gathered here, and someone must tell them. If you wish me to serve that purpose, I will try to compose my thoughts on whatever time is left to us, and then state our purpose and integrity simply and directly, if you wish it so. I thought it was beautifully put. I was cold and tired and hungry. Still, I admired that the Reverend, under such circumstances, could do near as well as he had done in church Sunday past. You must remember that he took off Friday and Saturday to prepare his Sunday sermon, and here was this, right off the top of his mind, in the pitch-black night. I suppose that Father could have bettered it, being used to throwing in an argument at the drop of the hat, but for a reflective man like the Reverend, it was all one could ask. I even began to look forward to his projected exchange with the British, and to imagine some of the things I might say in his place. Just for the sake of peace, I hoped that his thoughts ran to less colorful language than mine. When he finished, the applause came from all around, and it was plain that he had the sentiment with him. I can't express how relieved I felt. There is nothing that lessens one's warlike desire, passion, more than a few hours in the wet and cold of the night. and with the reassurance of the Reverend that this would be no more than a polite and skillful exchange of words and principles, I began to anticipate the finish of it and work up a certain amount of indignation at whatever was holding up the arrival of the British. In all truth, I must admit that one of the things I felt I simply could not face was the possibility of being left out of whatever would happen. I could imagine the other boys talking about it and holding up their own personal deeds, the way boys do, and strutting in front of the girls, and the thought that I might be out of all this was just heartbreaking. But now it would be all right. I would have my cake and eat it, so as to speak. A number of the women and some of the younger boys had drifted out to the common. Jonas Parker and Simon Caspar told them in no uncertain terms that they were to go home and stay out of the way. Then Jonas Parker yelled for the militia to fall into parade order and dress up. I had drilled enough with them to know what to do, and I found myself placed next to Abel Loring in the second rank. Aside from Parker, Caspar, Father, and the Reverend, 66 men had turned out for the muster. Even though there had been some argument as to the actual number, I know this for a fact, because once we were in rank, Parker had us count off, and the count came to exactly 66. With the 4 men in front of the rank, there were 70 of us assembled on the common, 2 lines of men, 33 in each line. At first, there was something of a scramble on where they would get a good view of everything that happened, but even the Reverend agreed that the British would get a better impression of us if they saw mature men instead of boys, and he and Parker and Father and Caspar went down the ranks, moving the boys back and the men up front. The one exception was Jonathan Harrington. He was 17 but small for his age, and he didn't look much more than 14 or 15, but he was a musician. The long-range plan was that we would have a regular corps of 4 drums and 4 fifes, and the Committee of Concord had been promising us the drums for weeks, but only 1 drum came through. Willie Diamond carried it until his mother drove him home and into bed. Abel Loring played the fife, and so did Nathan Hamble. But Hamble was in bed with a bad sore throat, and Abel Loring had forgotten to bring his fife when he joined the muster. Jonathan Crisp and I pressed him to run home for it, but he was afraid that if he did, the British would turn up while he was gone, and he'd miss all the fun. That left Jonathan Harrington as our only real musician, and he argued there was no point in having a musician unless he played his piece where the enemy could see it. His father was there, and I could see that he wasn't pleased with the notion of his son standing in front when all the rest of us were in the back. Father didn't like the idea either, but Jonathan argued so hard and persistently that they gave way, and he took his place at one end of the front rank, just as proud as Punch. We stood facing east, and it must have been past 5 o'clock in the morning now, for when you looked at the eastern sky and then at the western sky, you could see how the one was lightning, and the other still a deep charcoal lit brightly with stars. The Reverend said to Jonathan Harrington, "Well, Jonathan, since your persistence has won your point, what can you play to ease our waiting?" "Anything you say, sir." "Would you render Old 100? "Oh, yes, sir." Jonathan grinned. Well, all of us smiled a little when Reverend mentioned Old 100, just as we would have been disappointed if he hadn't. It was his favorite hymn. He still had in his house, I had seen it once, the original parchment sheet music that his folks had brought over from old Amsterdam 150 years ago, and which was supposed to have been hand-lettered by Henry Ainsworth. And there was almost never a Sunday when he didn't call for the singing of it. Now we took it up, all of us with full voice, so that they could hear it in the houses and know how high our spirits were, singing, "Show to Jehovah all the earth, serve ye Jehovah with gladness. Before him come with singing mirth, know that Jehovah he, God is." It was strange, but after we sang the one hymn, a pall fell upon us. The pall is like a depression. I knew that I was thinking about Jonathan Harrington and how he had been talking of marriage with Bessie Suderland, and I thought how terrible it would be if he should be struck down, standing as he was in the first row, and how would Bessie Suderland feel? It was a foolish way to think. I looked at the men and boys around me, and their faces were gray and drawn and old in the pre-dawn. The whole eastern sky was gray now. We were a part of it, and the gray lay in dew upon the grass of the common. My belly was queasy, but out of fatigue, not out of fear, and I told myself that the British would not come. Had we made fools of ourselves? How did the men feel standing here in lines on the common, with every manner of weapon and bird guns, muskets, matchlocks, rifles, and even an old blunderbuss that Ephraim Drake insisted was the best weapon ever invented. Then Father and Jonas Parker walked down our line and reminded everyone to see their flints were not on cock. They didn't want any accidents, they said. Father looked at me and smiled and nodded. That picked up my spirits a good deal. I took the bit of flannel off my flint. Far in the distance, shots were fired. We heard them. The sound was like twigs snapping in the winter frost. Everyone became tense, and men leaning on their guns picked them up, held them in both hands. In the west, the dark band of night washed away. The birds began to sing around the common, the way they do in the hour before dawn. A cloud high in the sky turned pink with the first reflection of the sun. But the east, the direction of the Monotony Road, was still full of haze and mist. Then, after all the waiting, all the climax... Okay, picking up where I left off. I believe I left off that the Monotony Road was still full of haze and mist. And then, after all the waiting, all the climax and the anticlimax of the long night, the British came and dawn came. Men who were talking dropped their voices to whispers, and then the whispers stopped, and in the distance, through the morning mist, we heard the beat of the British drums. It began as a rustle, then it was the sound of a boy running through the reeds of a dry swamp. Then it was my own sound as I ran along a picket fence with a stick, and how did I come to be here grown with a gun in my wet hands? In other words, the sound, he's imagining what the sounds could be. Fear began. I felt it prickle on my spine. I felt it like a weight in my belly. I felt it like a sickness around my heart, and its accompaniment was the steady, increasing roll of the redcoat drums. The Reverend smiled and pointed to Jonathan Harrington, who whistled up the tune of Come Swallow Your Bumpers, a song that everyone was singing in Boston and through the country. But no one sang, not even the Reverend. Jonathan Harrington played on alone, but then he stopped playing as the redcoats came marching out of the lifting mist. Then we were silent and tight as strings drawn to the snapping point, and my hands hurt as they gripped the gun. Many of the men half raised their guns and bent a little, but we boys looked at each other and licked our lips and tried to smile. And in the front of our lines, Jonas Parker, my father, Simon Casper, and the Reverend moved closer together. When the British first saw us, they were on the road past Buckman's. First, there were 3 officers on horseback, then 2 flag bearers, one carrying the regimental flag and the other bearing the British colors, then a corps of 8 drums, then rank after rank of redcoats, stretching back on the road and into the curtain of mist, and emerging from the mist constantly, so that they appeared to be an endless force and an endless number. It was dreamlike and not very believable, and it caused me to turn and look at the houses around the common, to see whether all the rest of what we were, our mothers and sisters and brothers and grandparents, were watching the same thing we watched. My impression was that the houses had appeared by magic, for I could only remember looking around the darkness and seeing nothing, where now all the houses stood, and the houses were dead and silent, every shutter closed and bolted, every door and storm door closed and barred. Never before had I seen the houses like that, not even in the worst cold or the worst storms. And the redcoats did not quicken their pace or slow it, but marched up the road with the same even pace, up to the edge of the common, and when they were there, one of the officers held up his arm, and the drums stopped, and the soldiers stopped, the line of soldiers stretching all the way down the road and into the dissipating mist. They were about 150 paces away from us. The 3 officers sat on their horses studying us. The morning air was cold and clean and sharp, and I could see their faces and the faces of the redcoat soldiers behind them, the black bands of their knapsacks, the glitter of their buckles. Their coats were red as fire, but their light trousers were stained and dirty from the march. Then one of the officers sang out to them, "Fix bayonets!" Remember, bayonets are the swords that go on the end of a gun. And all down the line, the bayonets sparkled in the morning sun, and we heard the ring of metal against metal as they were clamped onto the guns. One of the officers spurred his horse, and holding it at hard check, cantered onto the common with great style, rode past us and back in a circle to the others. He was smiling, but his smile was a sneer. And I looked then at my father, whose face was hard as rock, and hard and gray with the stubble of the morning beard upon it. I touched my own smooth cheeks, and when I glanced at the men near me, found myself amazed by the shadow of beard on their faces. I don't know why I was amazed, but I was. Then another British officer, I discovered afterward that he was called Major Pitcairn, called out orders, columns right, and then by the left flank, and drums to the rear. The drummers stood still and beat their drums, and the redcoats marched past them smartly, wheeling and parading across the common, while the 3 mounted officers spurred over the grass with a sharp canter, straight across our front and then back, reining in their prancing horses to face us. Meanwhile, the redcoats marched onto the common, the first company wheeling to face us when it was past our front of 33 men, the second company repeating the exercise until they made a wall of redcoats across the common, with no more than 30 or 40 paces separating us. Even so close, they were unreal. Only their guns were real, and their glittering bayonets too, and suddenly I realized, and I believed that everyone else around me realized, that this was not to be an exercise or a parade or an argument, but something undreamed of and unimagined. I think the Reverend was beginning to speak when Major Pitcairn drove down on him so that he had to leap aside. My father clutched the Reverend's arm to keep him from falling and wheeling his horse. Major Pitcairn checked the beast so that it pawed at the air and neighed shrilly. The Reverend was speaking again, but no one heard his words or remembered them. The redcoats were grinning, small, pinched faces under the white wigs. They grinned at us. Leaning over his horse, Major Pitcairn screamed at us. Lay down your arms, you lousy bastards. Disperse, do you hear me? Disperse, you lousy peasant scum. Clear the way, do you hear me? Get off the King's Green. At least those were the words that I seem to remember. Others remembered differently, but the way he screamed in his strange London accent, with all the motion and excitement, with his horse rearing and kicking at the Reverend and Father, with the drums beating again and the fixed bayonets glittering in the sunshine, it's a wonder that any of his words remained with us. Yet for all that, this was a point where everything appeared to happen slowly. Abel Loring clutched my arm and said dryly, "Adam, Adam, Adam." He let go of his gun and it fell to the ground. "Pick it up," I said to him, watching Father, who pulled the Reverend into protection of his body. Jonas Parker turned to us and cried at us, "Steady, steady, now just hold steady." We stood still in our 2 lines, our guns butt end on the ground or held loosely in our hands. Major Pitcairn spurred his horse and raced between the lines. Somewhere away from us, a shot sounded. A redcoat soldier raised his musket, leveled it at Father, and fired. My father clutched his breast, then crumpled to the ground like an empty sack and lay with his face in the grass. I screamed. I was 2. One part of me was screaming. Another part of me looked at Father and grasped my gun in aching hands. Then the whole British front burst into a roar of sound and flame and smoke, and our whole world crashed at us and broke into little pieces that fell around our ears and came to an end, and the roaring, screaming noise was like the jubilation of the damned. I ran. I was filled with fear, saturated with it, sick with it. Everyone else was running. The boys were running and the men were running. Our 2 lines were gone, and now it was only men and boys running in every direction that was away from the British, across the common and away from the British. I tripped and fell into the drainage ditch, banged my head hard enough to shake me back to some reality, pulled myself up, and saw Samuel Hoadley standing above me with a ragged hole in his neck, the blood pouring down over his white shirt. We looked at each other. Then he fell dead into the ditch. I vomited convulsively, and then kneeling there, looked back across the common. The British were advancing at a run through a ragged curtain of smoke. There was nothing to oppose them or stop them, except for the crumpled figures of the dead laying here and there. Our militia was gone. The last of them were running toward the edge of the common, except for one man, Jonas Parker, who staggered along holding his belly, his hands soaking red with the blood that dripped through them. 2 redcoat soldiers raced for him, and the one who reached him first drove his bayonet with all his plunging force into Parker's back. "Oh, no!" I screamed. "No, God, no, no!" I'll finish up at home tonight. Okay, I'm continuing. Then I saw redcoats coming at a trot on the other side of the ditch, and through my sickness and terror and horror, realized somehow that if I remained here I would be trapped, and it was not death I was afraid of, or being taken by them, or getting a musket ball, but that thin, glittering bayonet going into my vitals or tearing through my back the way it had with Jonas Parker. So I leapt up and ran, still holding onto my gun without ever knowing that I held it. The soldiers saw me and ran to cut me off, but I fled past them across the common, leaped the fence and ran between two shuttered, blind houses and tumbled down behind a pile of split kindling and crouched there, vomiting again, over and over until my chest and shoulders ached with the convulsive effort of it. Then I ran behind the house and another house, and there was the Harrington house, the Harrington smokehouse, and I hid in there with the hams and butts and sides of bacon over me. I crawled into a corner, put my face in my hands, and lay there sobbing. At 15, you can still manufacture a fantasy and believe it for at least a few moments, and I had the need for such fantasy, or I would lose my wits and senses completely. So I began to tell myself that none of this had happened, that it was all something I had invented and dreamed, that I had never at all awakened during the night, that my father was not dead, that the others were not dead. I didn't believe any of this fantasy, you must understand. I know that I was inventing it. I knew it, but I had to invent. I had to invent it and use it to get hold of myself and to stop the screaming and pounding inside of my head. In that way it worked. I was able to stop my convulsive sobbing and to sit with my back to the smokehouse wall and just cry normally. Once I had established a fantasy about my father being alive, I was able to break it down and argue with myself, and then accept the fact that father was dead. He was dead. He had been shot by a musket ball, and if that had not killed him, then a bayonet had been driven into him the way I saw the bayonet driven into Jonas Parker. No one had fallen down on the common and lived. I knew that. We had made a mistake. We were stupid people. We were narrow people. We were provincial people. But over and above everything, we were civilized people, which was the core of everything. We were going to argue with the British and talk them out of whatever they intended. We knew we could do that. We were the most reasonable, talkative people in all probabilities that the world had ever seen. And we knew we could win an argument with the British, hands down. Why, no one on our side had even thought of firing a gun, because when you come right down to it, we didn't like guns and did not believe in them. Yes, we drilled on the common and had all sorts of fine notions about defending our rights and our liberties, but that didn't change our attitude about guns and killing. That British Major Pitcairn on his champing horse knew exactly what we were and how we thought. He knew it better than we knew it ourselves. And now my father was dead. It was so absolute, it closed over me like a blanket of lead. He would never come home again. He had put his arm about me the night before and had given me such a feeling of love and closeness as I had never known in all my life. But he wouldn't do it again. He was like Samuel Hoadley, with the blood pouring out of him, and I began to think of how much blood a man has, and you just never know that a man can bleed so much, a red river coming out of him, until you see it happen. And then I began to think about Mother and ask myself whether she and Granny and Levi had watched the whole thing from the upstairs windows and how they had felt when they saw it happen. If you could dig the deepest well in the world and call it misery, you could find the place of my feelings then. I sat there and cried. I hadn't cried so much since I was a small boy, very small, because a boy gets over crying early in a town like ours. God have mercy on me, I said to myself. I am losing my mind, and soon I'll be no better than half-wit Jephthah in Concord, who is 60 years old with the brains of a 5-year-old. And now I'm hearing voices. I was hearing voices. I heard a thin, cracked, wailing voice. Adam Cooper, are you around? Are you alive? I opened the door of the smokehouse, and there across the yard was my brother Levi. Levi, I whispered. He jumped like a startled rabbit and looked all around him. Levi, here in the smokehouse. Then he saw me in the open door, ran to me, and threw himself sobbing into my arms, hanging on to me as if I was the only thing left in the whole world. He was crying now for it to break his heart, and that dried up the tears in me. I have noticed that when you have two brothers in a difficult situation and one begins to cry, the other usually contains himself. That was the way it happened to me. I pulled him into the smokehouse, closed the door behind us, and said, "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for you." "Well, who sent you to look for me?" "Granny did. Adam, Father's dead." "How do you know?" "I saw him dead. He had 2 bullet holes in his chest," he sobbed. "They shot him dead, Adam. Those lousy, rotten redcoats shot him dead. That's my father. They shot him dead, Adam." He was shivering and shaking. I shook him until he'd calmed down and was crying evenly again. Then I put my arm around him and squeezed him the way Father had done to me, to show him that I wasn't angry. "Where did you see Father?" I asked him. "Out on the common. Granny and Mother ran out there, and I went with them. First the redcoats tried to stop us, but Granny was so wild and terrible angry that they let her go, and she fell down on her knees where Father was lying and began begging him he shouldn't be dead, because out of 5 sons he was the last one. But Mother just grabbed onto me and held me and looked at Father, and just wailing and wailing, crying like a little girl. And it was terrible, terrible, Adam. It was just more terrible than anything, just more terrible, oh, Adam, I tell you. Then a redcoat soldier came over, and he said something to Mother about could he help. I don't know exactly what he said, because you can't understand them so good, the way they speak. And Granny stood up and spit in his face and said things to him like I never heard her say before. Goody Simmons was there, and her sister, and the 4 of them, they picked up Father and carried him into the house. And there were dead people all over the common, with the women crying and wailing, and the redcoat soldiers all over everywhere. "Who else was dead?" I whispered. "I don't know all of them. I didn't look. Some of them were across the common, and there were 2 men lying in the drainage ditch. I think one of those was Jonas Parker. Caleb Harrington is dead. Then I saw Jonathan Harrington crawling along through his own blood. The blood was running out under him, and there was some women trying to help him, and he was crying. Isaac Muzzy was lying next to Father. He was dead. He was all cut with bayonets, and they had smashed in his head." He began to shake again, and I held him for a while and quieted him. "They killed Father," he said. "Father's dead, Adam. Did you know that?" "I know that, Levi," I said softly, "but he didn't feel any hurt or pain out of it. I saw how they shot him. It never hurt him at all." "It hurts to be dead." "No, it doesn't." "How do you know?" I know, I said. "Stop shaking. Everything is going to be all right." "It'll never be all right again. Father's dead." "Well, people die. People die. Don't you think Father knew that he could die when he went out there to stand up to the British? Then why did he go?" "He had to go," I told him. "He had to go." "Why didn't you kill the British?" He had asked it finally, and then someone else, and then someone else, and they would never stop asking why no one, not one of us, fired his gun. Not one shot, not one show of force or courage or anything like that, but only the running away. He must have felt it in me in the darkness, and he said, "I didn't mean that, Adam. It wouldn't make Father alive," I muttered. "Father's dead. We have to think of what to do." "He had 2 holes in his chest," Levi said. "What did Granny say to you?" "They laid him down on the dining room table. Goody Simmons began to wash him. His face was dirty and bloody, but Mother just stood there and said, 'Moses Cooper, Moses Cooper.'" "Don't keep on talking about it and thinking about it. He's dead." "What did Granny tell you to say to me? Can I come home?" "You can't come home. There are redcoats all over the place. She says to hide in the woods back of Cousin Simmons' house until darkness falls. Then we can hide you in the house." Yes, I thought, I'll hide in the house and hide in the woodshed, and even if I come out into the sunshine one day, I'll still be hiding. "Will you do that, Adam?" "Tell them not to worry about me. I'll be all right." "You wouldn't run away, Adam," he begged me. "You wouldn't run away and leave me all alone." "Of course not." We sat quietly in the darkness for a few minutes. Levi pressed close to me, pushing his face into my jacket. He felt small and helpless, and I was filled with guilt for all the times we had quarreled and all the names we had called each other. And I told myself that from now on, I would take care of him just as if I were his own father. "You'd better go home now," I said to him. "I guess it's bad enough at home with all the misery they've got, without worrying about what happened to you and me." "What shall I tell them?" "I'll come later when it's safe. I'll be all right. I'll take care of myself." But when Levi slipped out of the smokehouse, I was alone again and afraid again, and no one to come between myself and my fear and grief. All right, that was a pretty heavy chapter. So let's talk about it before we start answering the questions.